Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology, From the Ground Down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Well, good day, people. My name is Dr. George Sparks, and I have a special guest, Dr. David Graves. We are going to talk about Mount Sinai, where it is, where it isn't. Has it really been located? What are the choices and the options? That's what we're going to talk about today. David Graves is a PhD from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, a native of Canada, has been involved in teaching the Bible and archaeology for more than 35 years, retired as assistant professor from Liberty University, Rawlings School of Divinity in Lynchburg, Virginia. He has taught archaeology at Oxford University, England, provided tours of the Ashmolean and the British Museum, traveled extensively in the Middle East, been involved in the Mount Ararat Research Project, consultant to National Geographic Productions. He has been involved also in archaeology excavations at Qumran, the Temple Mount, Shiloh, all those are in Israel, as well as Tel El Hammam excavation project in Jordan. In January 2017, he was part of the team who excavated the Dead Sea Scroll Cave number 53 near Qumran, Israel, and discovered evidence that this cave once contained Dead Sea Scrolls. The cave is now identified as Qumran 12, Q12. For many years, David has been a field supervisor at Tel El Hammam excavation project. He has also been a member, or is a member, at Near Eastern Archaeological Society, NEAS. He has authored a number of books published through his company, Electronic Christian Media. In addition, he has authored a number of different journals, articles on the Bible and archaeology. Most are available through academia.ed or edu. So academia.edu. So welcome, Dr. David Graves.
Good to be with you, George, as always.
Well,
Look forward to it.
So today, the Mount Ararat, I was getting ready to say the Mount Ararat sifting project because we were talking about mountains earlier before we got started.
Yes.
Mount Ararat, Mount Sinai, and then I mentioned in the little article right here with your bio that you are around Qumran, but we are back at Mount Sinai. Hey, before we get going, in the biblical narrative, it's called Mount Sinai and also Mount Horeb. Is that correct?
Yes, Mount Hor and Mount Horeb.
Okay. So, but it's okay. I don't want to get ahead because I don't know what you're going to talk about yet. But so for the listening audience, if two different narratives are used by Dr. Grave and either it's Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, understand this technically the same place. Just a heads up on it. All right, ready to go.
All right, well, we'll get started here. We're going to talk about Mount Sinai and has it been found or located? And there are some people out there that have claimed they have found it. But what I want to just dive into is some of the different locations and some of the arguments and some of the difficulties in trying to nail this and boil it down. So it's all based on material from my book on the archaeology of the Old Testament. As always, I bring the footnotes with the receipts. So if you want further information, academic information, you can check out that book. One of the claims is by Emmanuel Anatim, and he says that it's at Har Karkum. This is up in the southern Negev, a little plateau there in the desert. Not a lot of folks agree with that. Some of the reasons for that I'll show you here in a moment. We're going to look at Jebel Musa, Mount Sinai, and St. Catherine's Monastery in a little bit, because it's one of the locations. And of course, people will know their Bibles. This is where Moses received the 2 tablets of stone on Mount Sinai, and that's why it's so important to try and locate it, or why people want to locate it. Johann Haroni, a famous Israeli archaeologist, says today the problem of identifying the route of the Exodus and Mount Sinai itself, because as you know, those two things go together. The journey of the Exodus, what route did they take? That also involves Mount Sinai. He says that those two things itself is one of extraordinary difficulty, far more than any other problem of Palestinian biblical topography, the lay of the land. And I think that statement is a fair statement to make. And it's not as easy as some YouTubers make it out to be, trying to identify where Mount Sinai is located. So what are some of the guiding clues we have in Scripture? Well, it has to be within a 3 days journey into the wilderness from Goshen, the land of Goshen up in southern Egypt. Now I'm talking about the North Delta area. That's called southern Egypt. You have to turn things upside down when you're talking about northern Egypt and southern Egypt, just for those of you who might get confused with that. The Nile River runs down into the Mediterranean. That drains down into the south part of Egypt. So that's called southern Egypt. And that's what we called in the Bible Goshen. And that's where the Israelites were living originally before they left in the Exodus. So it's a 3 days journey from Goshen. It has to be a 14 days journey from Elam, according to Exodus 16. For a mass of people, a day's journey was assumed to be about 15 kilometers per day. A 14-day journey would be about 210 kilometers. So you have to do a little bit of math, a little calculating. It's also 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. As you mentioned earlier, George, Mount Horeb is Mount Sinai, the mountain that we understand to be down in the Sinai Peninsula. But it was originally called Mount Horeb. So Deuteronomy says it should be 11 days journey between Kadesh Barnea, which we generally understand where that is. A little side note, it was Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, who identified what most people acknowledge to be the location of Kadesh Barnea. That's in my book on the history of biblical archaeology that I've just released. Kadesh Barnea and Mount Sinai must have been located at a distance from each other that could reasonably have been expected to take 11 days for an entire nation of people with small children and flocks and equipment and perhaps even elderly members to travel on foot. If you remember the famous movie, The Ten Commandments, as they were leaving Egypt, gives you a sense in your mind of what that might have looked like as they pack up their things and head out into the wilderness. The pace established by this distance of 11 days should most likely be considered the typical pace for the Israelites as they traveled from place to place along that path and that journey as well. So using those guiding references, we can have a bit of an idea as to how far they could have traveled and be within a goat's grazing distance of Midian territory, because Moses was tending his father-in-law's goats at the time that he encountered Mount Sinai in Exodus 3. Based on the modern Bedouin practices, this was assumed to be about 45 to 60 to 70 kilometers from a camp, or further in the event of a drought. So it may not have been 145 kilometers, it could have been about half of that as well. So we're not talking about great distances. The Midianite pottery and art have been found at Timnah, assumed to be the only Midianite enclave in the Sinai. So we know where Timnah might be. So we do the math on all of this, and we have some proposals that people have made. They range from the area of Kadesh Barnea, the northern Sinai Peninsula, to Gebel Hasham et Tarif, and Jebel. Jebel means mountain. Jebel Magara, and Jebel Sin Bashir. And some suggest the Northwest Arabia, Midian, and Saudi Arabia. Some have suggested the Jebel Al Laz. Al Laz is in Saudi Arabia. The different spellings are Jebel. In Hebrew, the B is pronounced with a V, so or a V is a B, Jebel. To the traditional location in the southern Sinai Peninsula of Jebel Musa. We'll look at that one in a moment. Here's a map I like. A friend of mine, Stephen Rudd, has put together a map, what he believes are some of the sites and their locations on the map. He puts an X where over top of the Red Sea crossings. He puts an X over the rejected locations that he believes are not. I disagree with his conclusion, but he's still a good friend. He likes to put it at Mount Laz, and then he puts Petra at Kadesh Barnea, and I don't agree with that. But Mount Hor is actually close to Petra. But it's a good map just to give you an idea of the locations of some of these different possible mountains. So my map is this one in my book. We have the Goshen area right here. This is the lower Egypt. And then you have Kadesh Barnea over here. I don't put it at Petra, which would be over here. This is where Stephen Rudd likes to place it, but I don't think I think it's over here. T. Lawrence placed it there. So this is the two places they're going to journey between these two places, and then they're going to encounter Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. So this is the northern route in red, how they went along the sea. Eliezer Oren has taken this particular route to get to Kadesh Barnea. And his Mount Sinai is Mount Hor, right here by Petra, or close to Petra. That's probably why Stephen Rudd likes Petra to be Kadesh Barnea. But I think it's probably Mount Hor is over here and Kadesh Barnea is likely over here. Again, that's debated, and you can get into all the weeds on that one, but it's pretty complicated. So there's Petra, Mount Hor there. Now in my book originally, I have Mount Hor over here, but Mount Hor is actually over here. So you'll have to kind of X that out in my map in my book. I discovered a mistake when I was preparing this slide late last night. Here's Mount Hor, the Mount of Aaron. It's also called Jebel Haron. There's another view of it, and it's one of the candidates for biblical Hor, Mount Hor, or Horus. Here we have it's got a Byzantine monastery there, and it also has a Mamluk mosque dedicated to Aaron's tomb. There's the tomb of Aaron that we find on top of it, the mosque. So it's traditionally been accepted by some to be the place where Aaron died. The second route is the central route. This is the dotted red line. Dr. Bryant Wood takes this particular route, and he places the Mount Sinai at Jebel Karsham at Tarif. Now, it's here in the wilderness of Pan, and he makes some arguments for. The biggest argument is that it's, within the 11 days needed to travel that distance to that location. Here it is here, what it looks like, and there's some interesting stone structures, stone pictures zoomorphic and sacrificial items around this. So around the base of the mountain, it looks like it could have been a perfect location for the people of Israel to have camped while Moses goes up to the mountain receiving the Decalogue, or the tablets of stone. So that's the central route, and the Mount Sinai associated with it. And then we go to the southern route, which is the blue line. And you see the traditional route goes around. The central route, the red dotted line, would go to Ezion-Geber, and then Timnah, and then up to Kadesh Barnea, and then into the land. Again, they could have gone here and then gone up to Mount Horeb, but this is a further distance. So this location seems to be the 11 days needed to go from here to here, according to the text. The Mount Sinai associated with the southern route is the traditional location of Jebel Musa, the Mount Horeb of tradition down here in the southern Sinai. Now, I've traveled down there. It was quite a long drive to go from Cairo all the way down to the region. Here's the monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery, at the base of Mount Musa. Jebel Musa simply means the mountain of Moses. Musa is Moses, Jebel is mountain, Mount Sinai, the Mount of Moses. So traditionally, this is what it has been called. Here's a view from the top of the rugged mountain structure over the southern Sinai. Beautiful up there, actually, when you go up. We went up early in the morning at dark on camels and to see the sunrise over top of Mount Sinai. Quite beautiful to see that. And there's the monastery, close up on the monastery again. You can go inside and actually tour around. And this is one of the structures on the top of Mount Jebel Musa. It's sort of a little church they've built on the top. What's significant about this monastery is it's one of the famous biblical books was discovered there. It's called the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex meaning book, Sinaiticus being named after the Mount Sinai. And it's one of the few almost entire copies we have of the Old Testament scriptures written in Greek and unsealed, which is the capital letters on parchment. And it was found actually in a garbage can. And Constantine von Tischendorf was the guy that discovered it in a garbage can. And he pulled it out, and they were using it to light the fire, the paper, light the fires and keep them going. And he rescued it. So the story goes, some have disputed that story, but nonetheless, interesting one. It's in my book on the history of biblical archaeology. If you want to read the account on the ins and outs of all of that. But interesting, they found it here at this monastery that's been there for many, many years. From the early 4th century, the Christian tradition is located in Mount Sinai in the south end of the Sinai Peninsula. Even Eusebius of Caesarea claims that it was there. So very, very early in church tradition, the tradition is that it's that location. The specific identification with Jebel Musa is clearly attested by this lady called Egeria from 381 to 384 AD. Already in her time, a monastery existed at the foot of the mountain that she visited, and writes in her diary about having seen it, with Justinian later rebuilding it and making it. They've been doing a lot of work on it. And there are monks living there even to this day. Possible evidence of this location existed in the 2nd century AD in Jewish sources, but other early evidence is imprecise or points to a location closer to Palestine. So again, the debate rages. Those are some of the clues we need to take into consideration. And the New Testament talks about it. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. So Paul identifies Mount Sinai in Arabia. Now, what we need to realize is that when Paul wrote this, it's during the Roman period. And during the Roman period, Arabia included Mount Sinai, or the Sinai Peninsula, as one of its provinces. So it's part of Arabia, Nabatea, as we see here in this map of the Roman period, the first century. So sometimes people will take and, oh, look, Paul says in Galatians that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. We all know that Saudi Arabia is where it should be located. And they don't understand you can't look at a modern map and trying to figure out what things looked like during the first century in the Roman period, because clearly Arabia was a province and Sinai was part of Arabia in the Roman provinces that they identified during that time period. So don't take a modern map and use it to find ancient sites, because you're going to get sidetracked. Another example of that is we already talked about Ephesus right here. It's about 2 miles inland today. Well, it had a harbor, and people, well, it couldn't have had a harbor because it's 2 miles inland. Well, that's because the harbor silted up. And from the first century time period, the coastline has changed since the first century. So you need to keep that in mind when you're doing biblical research. Don't use modern maps and modern references to try and find those things. Well, there's the Nile River, and that's my quick tour of some of the ins and outs of Mount Sinai and why it's not so easy to find it. And there are many different options, and you pay your money and take your choice.
I didn't realize there are that many selections. I knew there were maybe the two popular ones would be, of course, where St. Catherine's Monastery is at, and the second one would be that the one that you mentioned. I believe you said Sinai, no, Arabia.
Yeah, Laws.
And I think it was associated early on, and we mentioned this before the podcast. If that's the one that was mentioned by Ron Wyatt years ago.
Yeah.
So more than 20. And I think mainstream archaeologists have said no. For what reasons, I don't remember. I remember reading it, and there's supposed to be something like a split rock there. And they said, well, this is the rock that Moses hit and the water came out. And it looks burnt. From a distance, it looks burnt. I think really it was like basalt. Well,
yeah.
Basalt is dark, right? We got basalt volcanoes close to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Of course, they're extinct. So from a distance, they all look black. So just being black does not mean it was burnt with fire. So there's so much pseudo-science. That's what I'm saying. Pseudo-science mixed in with trying to find Mount Ararat.
Now,
it does get confusing.
I want to go back and mention I lean a little bit toward Et Tarif, just because of the geography. I'm not, if somebody can find, empirical evidence at one of these other sites for sure, I'm happy with that. But a Canadian guy, he's a journalist who has claimed to be an archaeologist. He's got a program on television that probably many of our viewers might have heard of called The Naked Archaeologist.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But luckily, he's not naked. It's just the name.
Simcha. He's not naked and he's not an archaeologist. But he actually did the program on Mount Sinai, claiming this location was Mount Sinai. And I need to point out to you is that Dr. Bryant Wood, many years earlier, the Associates for Biblical Research, wrote articles in the Bible and Spade magazine that made the arguments that Shimcha took. And, he doesn't give his sources. He doesn't say who had this idea first, but it was actually a biblical archaeologist, Dr. Bryant Wood, that has done quite a bit of research on that. And he stole that information and created this sensational program on The Naked Archaeologist, identifying this place. using a bit of pseudoscience as well. Dr. Bryant Wood used archaeological evidence. He's got a PhD in archaeology from the University of Toronto. So his arguments are much better, I think, than Shimcha's, but the naked archaeologist claims this to be, and I would agree with this location. I don't always agree with the naked archaeologist because he just likes to produce a lot of pseudoscience. That little side note.
Right. Well, I agree. A lot of it's pseudoscience, but he does get excellent graphics. You got it.
Oh yes, yeah. He's good with this. He's good with the images.
Special effects are great, and
Yeah.
at least I give him that. I said this just draws you in just to see the special effects. Let's see.
The other thing to
Sure.
point out here about this central route is that it also runs along the King's Highway from Hierapolis over to Ezion Geber, and then the King's Highway runs up the plateau here in modern day Jordan. But for part of that route, it emulates using the King's Highway, which would be the natural route that ancient people would travel, well-trodden path, as we would say.
All right. Yeah, you got a lot of choices there: north, central, southern. But it has to be, according to the biblical narrative, a 3 days journey out of Egypt and 11 days from Kadesh Barnea.
Kadesh Barnea, that's right.
Wow, and then you'd have to think, okay, there's a question on numbers too. How many people left? Are we looking at millions? I don't want to get into that one, but there's a lot to consider in this whole thing.
We can safely say there were a lot of people.
Okay,
a lot of animals and a lot of belongings, regardless of what the numbers exactly were. It's just a lot of people. And so Jebel El Lawz over here in Saudi Arabia, I think it's just too far for them to have traveled, similar to Jebel Musa as well, given the biblical text. Now, some people might say, well, it was a miracle. God could have made them travel that far. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but
right.
I take those numbers in that particular passage as being fairly accurate. And
we are talking about archaeology, not theology.
exactly.
And,
precisely.
Right. The thing is like for myself, knowing the biblical narrative, and of course the theology, some of it within there. I do it kind of separate. I keep my archaeology separate because it's we like pottery and places and strata levels. So let's say that, for instance, if I'm going to any one of these sites and I'm going to do an excavation, just thinking archaeology, I'm going to be looking for evidence of pottery. Because if we can find pottery, that can be easily dated. Since they're coming out of Egypt, I would assume the pottery would be in an Egyptian style, not a Canaanite style.
Yeah.
Or somewhere in between, since they are Semitic in heritage, probably some kind of, if anything, what we call imitations made local. I'll give them that, but it's got to have some assimilation to Egyptian pottery, the place of origin where they've been for at least, depending on one's theories, hundreds of years. I'll just give it that, right? And also the land. I know land changes and climate changes. So we got to take, just like you said, geography. Geography doesn't change. However, descriptions of territories, not the descriptions, but the territories do change, the boundaries. All right. And you were talking about the boundaries of Arabia from the Roman period and today. And that's fair enough. And we got to also look at climate change, don't we? We can't assume that the climate in the Sinai was the same back then as it is now. I can't assume that. I have to go to an expert in that field and say, tell me what the Sinai would be like in the northern part, in the central part, in the southern part 3,500 years ago,
Yeah,
to get
well,
an assessment on which also of course, the lakes, when we think about the Yam Suf being the Sea of Reeds,
that's
and
right.
the reeds grow in salt water. And if reeds don't grow in salt water, we can eliminate salt water. So if there's a freshwater lake, we'd have to say 3,500 years ago, where would be the freshwater lakes? Also, roads that can be traveled, because they do mention names of, I think it is like almost like fortresses.
Yeah,
Um,
there's
and
the
I,
Bella Lake up here. So
okay,
I've got a photograph actually of the reeds growing in the Bella Lake. There's the Bitter Lake here. The other thing to notice is that the Nile River, all of these tributaries have dried up in modern times. There used to be 5, now there's only 2. So, we can't go back and look at the ancient text the same as we look at the modern text, or vice versa. So you have to look at things as they were in that time period. So there's a lot of factors to take into consideration. And then the Reed Sea, the Red Sea. Everybody, they all claim it's the Red Sea down here, but some scholars suggest it was the Bella Lake, the Reed Lake, the Reed Sea, the Bitter Lake here, perhaps. So there's a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know where all the oases were in ancient times, because some of them may have dried up. But the ancient people, what's interesting is that God told Moses to travel through this region with his sheep remember, he gets kicked out of Egypt, and he leaves Egypt, wanders for 40 years, and he's saying to himself, well, why am I doing all of this? And God says, well, I got a plan for you, because you're going to bring the people of Israel through here, and I want you to know every single watering hole and every single oasis where they're located. So that's why you're going to wander around here for 40 years prior to that, next 40 years, when you're traveling with my people. So I kind of can relate, because the first 20 years of my life, I was wondering what I was doing. And God says, well, I've got a plan for you later. And what you're learning now, you're going to use later. And I call it my Moses wandering experience.
mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that we don't know about the Sinai area today, because things have dried up, changed, geography changes. But there's no doubt in my mind that it happened, it took place. And just because we can't find empirical evidence for everything doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means we haven't got the evidence, haven't found it yet.
Well, that's correct. Let me ask you about, we have also in play the archaeologists, very well educated, great degrees, but they still can fall into an aspect of what we call maximalist, the ones in the middle that you call minimalist or something.
Minimalist.
And then you got the ones at the far end, the minus side. You got the plus side, the minus side. So we have to look at the archaeological reports and where those archaeologists stand as far as on that scale, which is a pendulum, because even their opinions change in time from their early books and their books that they have written later on in their careers. I noticed their opinion changes.
Yeah. Well, for example, for many years, they said the Hittites didn't exist. And then we discovered the Hittite civilization up in Turkey, modern day Turkey. And they have to change their tune, because we found their libraries, thousands of tablets. So we have the Hittite tablets. We've been able to translate them and read about their empire and their travels and the Lachish letters. And then we have the Abla tablets that talk about trading with them. So there's a lot that we're learning from archaeology that basically it just supports the biblical narrative, what the Bible says is um, is accurate and just as what the Bible says. Again, they called it Mount Horeb. We call it Jebel Musa, or we call it Mount Hor up here by Petra. That's probably closer to the Mount Horeb that we're talking about. But the names aren't the same on our maps today as they were back then. So a lot of these are Byzantine tradition or even earlier tradition. Although Jebel Musa goes, as I pointed out, goes back very, very early to even Eusebius as an identification. So it might be Mount Sinai. I'm not saying it's not. It just seems to be a long way from Goshen that they had to travel according to the biblical description. And I trust the Bible. Take it at its word. So I'm a biblical maximalist.
An archaeologist for you, who's I see on the internet that they talk about it quite a bit, and that's Hoffmeyer. Where does Hoffmeyer place? I know that he was doing some research in archaeology about the root, and he was finding the remains of, I guess it was like strongholds, what do you call it? Migdals, towers. Did you know Hoffmeyer's belief in that?
I saw it flash before me when I was researching this last night, and I can't remember which one it was, to be honest with you. But yeah, he's been doing some research in that area. Hoffmeyer's at Wheaton College. I think he's still there. But yeah, James Hoffmeyer is a fairly well-respected Christian archaeologist. But I just don't remember which route he's focusing on. I think it might be the central route, but I'm not positive on that.
Because I know he's talking about something, but okay, but his route, this is another one, and I know he goes with the late date.
Yeah.
So he was talking about the route of, had to do with the time of Ramses or his 13th son, Merneptah. So there's a lot of issues behind this thing, which routes were used. Some were used repetitively, the trade route, and then the native, not only do the territories change, but the routes don't change, but names do, because we can have the Via Maris during the Roman period, or we could have the trunk road, same thing, during the time period of Abraham. And as we get closer to Egypt, it was called the Way of Horus. Then we
and
get
the other thing to realize, George, is that we don't have firm boundaries. So people look at their Bible maps and say, oh, here's the Edomite territory, or here's the Moabite territory. And, it can't be that place because it's not Moabite territory, or it's an Edomite territory. Well, they didn't have firm boundaries. Even the rivers, you'd have the tribes, Bedouins, who are traveling from place to place. So it's just this general area that they're talking about was Edomite. This general area was Midian. This general area, was Amalekite, or this general area was Moabite. So, and so you have a lot of pottery that sort of transitions from different period or different groups as well. So the Edomite pottery looks a little bit like the Midianite pottery, and then you have the Nabatean stuff in Petra, which is a bit later. The Edomite stuff you'd find at Petra may be different from the pottery that they might have brought from Egypt down to a place for one of these mountains. So it's a complicated issue we have to work through as archaeologists, trying to make sense of the pottery, make sense of the artifacts, make sense of the geography, make sense of the history. But I love it because it's just like being a detective. You got to put the puzzle together.
Yeah, this is a complicated one, very complicated.
Yeah. And this one here with the Exodus and the roots on Mount Sinai, as was pointed out by Ahoni, is probably one of the most complicated, and it's not probably going to be resolved anytime soon. So don't believe every podcast video you see out there that says we've discovered Mount Sinai. They haven't. They just believe they have, but the empirical evidence is still waning on that one.
Yeah, I notice that sometimes when it has this sensationalism to it, and I'll just say sometimes, that you really don't have present a credentialed archaeologist.
No.
It seems like I'm not going to name professions, that's not fair, but as somebody that's not an expert in that field and they see something like a drawing. So they take the biblical narrative and they come up with something that is very sensational. Sounds good. I'll just say it sounds good if you're the laity in the pulpit. Now, I said that wrong. If you're in the pews, laity in the pews is subject to a lot of pseudo-science. If the wrong person is in the pulpit telling you about a biblical event.
Yeah.
And they're easily led. That's why I always talk about, do your own research. There's so much, and you can't really rely on YouTube and Google. It does get confusing. But the thing is, people, archaeologists, good ones are easy pretty much to email and ask them an initial question. Don't expect questions, to go back and forth like a ping pong match, but initial questions and they'll answer you right away. And sometimes it'll just be like, no, and then they'll give a quick reason and that'll be it. But and you can ask a number of archaeologists out there what they feel about this particular, like last week at my church, they said this. And I see you as a professor at this university or an expert, and you've written this book. You got to give them a little bit of, like, what do you want to say? That you know about them through their work, and ask him or her a question, and they're very gracious about giving answers. I know that, even if they're brief. And I'll tell you one. The last one I got was from not the last email, but the last really brief message was from Israel Finkelstein, a very prominent professor in Israel, right? No doubt. But his answer to me was, no, ha, ha, ha.
That sounds like Israel Finkelstein.
That was it. So anyway,
Sounds
I
like
got
it.
my answer. That's not lengthy, but that was fine. But anyway.
Yeah.
So, well, man, just the thing is with this type of a subject, there's just an endless amount of answers. Have you heard about this discovery? Don't you know about Ron Wyatt and the chariot wheels? Ron Wyatt, I know that comes out a lot, and wow. And the guy was an anesthesiologist, but he was led by God. So you got the faith issue mixed in with archaeology and different readings of the biblical narrative. And folks, we're aware of this, so we're not trying to be disrespectful to what you believe. And if you want to, put it in the comments. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I don't think you're going to hurt Dr. Graves' feelings either. Just say what's on your mind. Jump in, tell us what you believe. Give us an explanation for what like an explanation of why you do.
And there's a lot of people that follow Ron Wyatt, quite faithfully, and he's got a faithful following. Because he's put a lot of sensational material out there, claiming he's found all kinds of things. But think about the evidence of what he's proposing, and just go down a layer or two on things like he's claimed that he's found the chariot wheels, in the Red Sea, but when you analyze the photographs, they're not the chariot wheels from the time period. The spokes are different. The Israelites had 6 spoked wheels, and these are only 4, and or something like that. You need to analyze the evidence that's being presented to you and think critically, and just don't absorb everything that well-meaning people say. Even myself, That's why I've written my books and put footnotes at the bottom of the page so you can do your own research and think critically. We've lost this in our 2 clicks away from finding an answer on, I call it Wikipedia, and or YouTube or something like that. Somebody puts a nice, fancy looking, video up, like ours, and people just accept it as gospel. Think critically, do your research, and work through the evidence that's presented, and don't just accept everything that anybody says to you as being, gospel truth. The Bible's
Right.
true. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that says they claim to be a Bible believer is credible. So look at the primary source material. Look at the evidence. Well, that's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I seen one. Yeah, I seen a new because you sent me an email the other day. I think it was maybe yesterday evening, and I briefly said, let me look into that myself. I was going to go back when I went back on. I went to YouTube real quick to just see any new ideas on Mount Sinai. Of course, there were.
Yep.
And and it was fascinating, and I rather enjoyed it. Doesn't
Yeah.
mean that I believe it, but somebody's out there that sincerely believes it to go out there in the desert and do these videos.
Yeah.
And you know what? And when somebody does that, I gotta appreciate their efforts. And
George,
yeah.
this morning, I just got a flash of news that someone had, they've just discovered some new amphora, a new type of amphora from a shipwreck. And they've got all of these vessels inside the ship, and they got photographs of the different types. So they've just discovered a new type of amphora that they never knew existed before from the Roman period. So there's new stuff being discovered all the time, and we shouldn't close our minds and be open to new stuff that's being discovered on a pretty much daily basis. I just thought that was kind of exciting for me, being my specialty being the Roman period, that we've got a new amphora that we never knew existed before, and we have a number of them. They were carrying fish products, so
Really?
fish sauce and the garum and anchovies, and it was pretty cool to read the article and find they've discovered something new that we've never seen before, but now we know it existed.
Thank you for your time. We got a variety of choices here, folks. Maybe you could add a few more. We got another northern route, central route, southern route, and that's just the routes. And then we got a number of different choices for mountains. This is better than The Sound of Music. When she comes out, she's spinning on the mountain. But anyway, so thanks for your time. It's greatly appreciated.
Always fun to talk.